Welcome to week 7 of Intro to Youth Ministry. We are now really coming up to the end of this course, and so kind of putting the pieces together. And these last 2 weeks, weeks 7 and 8, are on the fourth stage of this four-stage approach to youth ministry that Dean lays out in her book. And so just to recap, the first three are this is sort of a cycle. We'll talk about this a little bit in a moment, but stage 1, she says, is understanding the concrete situation. Second is reflecting on current practices of youth ministry. And the third is detecting the theological assumptions guiding our practice of youth ministry. So we talked about that last week, about the theology that underlies our practice of youth ministry. And the fourth stage here, which we're going to split up between this week and next week because it's kind of a long one, is projecting a more faithful youth ministry. Here's how she defines this. She says it is addressing these questions. What means, strategies, and forms of persuasion best communicate the gospel in this concrete situation? How shall we reconstruct our action so it is more transparent to God's action on behalf of young people in this particular case? So what this is it builds on the first three. So if we understand the current situation and then we reflect upon our current practice in that concrete situation, and then we consider the theological assumptions and the theological implications of current practice, then the fourth stage is going back to the drawing board. It's taking all three of these together and saying, okay, how can we improve? And a way to think about or analogously, again, I'm really a biblical studies scholar who has also a background in youth ministry, but this is not my area of expertise. But the thing that sort of by way of comparison that occurs to me with this is that it's very, very similar to something that in biblical studies we refer to as the hermeneutical spiral. So I know Matt, having taken hermeneutics with me last year, would be familiar with this. But in hermeneutics, the hermeneutical spiral is the idea that the interplay between our theology and our reading of Scripture is a never-ending cycle. So when we read the Bible, we read it through the prism of a theology that we already have. We have assumptions. We have presuppositions about the Bible. That's what we call embedded theology. So we dealt with that a couple chapters back. So our embedded theology or our intuitive theology shapes the way we read the Bible, because the Bible being a text, it has to be interpreted, and that's why you have the same people, different people read the same text and they understand it differently. Is why we have denominations, why we have different theological traditions, because everyone comes to a different interpretation because of their perspective. And part of that is the embedded theology or the intuitive theology. And so we bring that to the text. It shapes how we see the text, but at the same time, the text challenges our embedded theology. It's not totally subjective. It's not this totally subjective, abstract piece of art that everyone just sees in it what they want to see or what they're predisposed to see. The text actually says things, and it's not compatible with every embedded theology or every intuitive theology. And so our encounter with the text shapes our theology. It changes it if we're open-minded and we allow it to. Now you can of course be very closed-minded and refuse to ever sort of step back from your embedded theology, and that just means you'll never learn anything. But for hopefully a good hermeneutics would be that our theology is always pliable. It's always subject to change as we read and better understand Scripture. So we bring other things to bear. Maybe we read commentaries, or we learn something about the background, or maybe we learn Greek or Hebrew, and suddenly we are able to see this text in a new light. It changes something about our theology. And then, of course, so now having our theology changed, we bring that new changed theology to a new reading of Scripture. And so that's the spiral. It's always a back and forth. Our embedded theology or our predispositions shape the way we read Scripture, but then Scripture also shapes our theology, and so it's a constant back and forth spiral. And hopefully, it gets tighter and tighter, and so that our theology improves. With this is these 4 steps here, and especially the last one here about projecting, is sort of a practical theology version of that hermeneutical spiral. So it's not just about interpretation, although it does include that. It's not simply about understanding the text. It's about how do we practice ministry. And so it's shaped by both our reading of Scripture and our theology. So the hermeneutical spiral is a part of that. Hopefully we're thinking biblically and theologically about our youth ministry, but it's also shaped by experience. We saw, hey, what worked last time? What didn't work well last time? What were maybe some of the implications? If we launched this particular program, we did this, outreach for our youth ministry, and then we thought about it, or we saw the results of it, and maybe we didn't realize it at the time, but maybe it fed into or rested upon a bad theology. Maybe so for example, imagine that, I'll use an example from my own experience. So my first youth pastorate in Texas was, I'd say, very, very heavy on sort of entertainment, heavy on let's just give the kids a fun outlet. Let's give them something fun to do. And I would say very low on actual ministry. So we didn't do a whole lot of like mission trips or service. We did a little bit, but for the most part, it seemed like the church and really the parents really just wanted a fun hangout in a Christian environment for their kids. And I understand that. I did challenge that in some ways. Where I kind of put my foot down was the discipleship, because that's my thing. So we did have to have Bible study. We did have to have worship. But in sort of that navigating, that negotiation with the church and with the parents, we ended up doing a lot of fun trips. To Six Flags or to baseball games, things like that. And we spent an awful lot of money. Now, and what happened here was that there was someone, I think it was a grandparent, an older lady in the church, who gave a very large amount of money, several $1,000s, to the youth fund, and it was to be designated for trips, and particularly for entertainment. So the youth group didn't really have to do fundraising. They could go on these fun outings, and the church would pay for it all. And I remember, like, my last thing that we did at that church, we went on a big trip up to the DFW area, and we went to Six Flags, we went to a water park, we went to a baseball game. It's just a huge vacation that the kids went on. And, the money had been given for that purpose, but I was always a little uncomfortable. I know the senior pastor was uncomfortable with this too. We felt like, what message is this sending to the kids? It's turning church and it's turning youth group into nothing but fun and games, and it's not teaching them responsibility either. They're not serving other people. It was a very self-centered kind of youth group in that sense. And I don't want to sound too bad. I mean, I really loved these kids, and I think some very good things happen in that youth ministry. But one thing I think we struggled with was being too self-centered and sort of fostering and feeding that self-centeredness in the kids, not having them earn the money to do these things, blowing it all on a fun outing which really had no ministry component to it. We could put it under the guise of fellowship. Oh, it's fellowship, building relationships with the kids. But we didn't really need any more of that. We were too heavy on that. So that would be an example for reflecting. Well, you would reflect on that, your current practice. So you understand the situation, you reflect on the current practice, and then you consider the theology. Is this feeding a bad theology? And I think it was. It was feeding a very self-centered, self-focused type of theology. It was not serving others. It was not focused on discipleship. It was just fun and games. So there was bad theology being fed there. And then the fourth step would be, well, what do we do about that? How do we project into the future? How do we do better next time? How do we modify our practice to improve? All right. So hopefully that makes sense. That's kind of what we're getting at here in these last couple weeks. Is the very concrete. It's the very practical side of this, about how to actually put everything else into practice. All right. So here's what I want you to do for discussion this week. I would like you to choose a scenario, and it could be either some. There are plenty of examples in the reading, not just this week, but across the whole book. Anything we've read, and that could even be in the Almost Christian book. You could pull stuff out of that too. Find a scenario. Find a situation. For example, a couple weeks ago there was the youth rally that failed. Right. The story about they tried to have the big youth rally and it turned into like political speakers, and at the end of the day they didn't really have the youth rally. Their main the main featured event, the concert, didn't really happen the way it was supposed to. It didn't really serve the youth. It didn't really accomplish the goal of the ministry. So something like that. Pick out a situation where something didn't work right, so it could be from the reading, or it could be from your own experience. Like I shared my experience. Maybe when you were in youth group, or if you've done any work with youth. Just find a scenario. I guess you can make one up if you want, but I'd prefer that it be something real, either from the reading or from your own experience, where something, a practice that was in place, and I want you to analyze it and do this fourth step, and that would be, well, how would you improve on this? What would you do different next time? Or since if it's not from your own experience, what should they do different? How would you improve on this ministry? How would you improve on this practice? So again, if you did like the youth rally, what would you do differently? What would you suggest? How would you counsel that they avoid making these same mistakes next time? So it's in some ways just to walk through all four steps, but really focus on that fourth one, on how would we build on this? How would we learn from this and improve this? So again, it can be either from your own experience or from the reading. But that's going to be the discussion question for this week. And then, again, a reminder to make sure you are working on your paper, the Philosophy of Youth Ministry paper, which is due end of next week. Or is it due the end of the month? So it's April 30th is when it's due. Well, so I'll leave you to it. That's really it. If you have any questions about the paper, feel free to email me. And I'll answer those questions. But I'll leave you to the reading for this week and to think about that discussion question.